Does love make the world go round? Or to put it another way, does everybody want to be loved? And if someone is highly loving, then why doesn't everybody respond to this? There is, for instance, a psychologist who passed away recently, Sean Stephenson, and he had issues of being very short. And I'm trying to remember what other issues too. And he died around the age of 40. And he used to lecture to include in prisons. And he said once on a YouTube video, filmed inside of a prison, that even the most aggressive men in prison also want to be loved. But if so, why is it sometimes we see some people who just don't seem to respond, and yet we consider ourselves, maybe with good reason, to be highly loving? We can't thus understand, are we simply imagining we're highly loving or loving enough? For of course nobody can be perfect in loving, or I would redefine this to mean perfect in terms of respect level to others. Respect, some say, or being gotten, the most important thing to many. So what gives? You might say too, well, sometimes survival trumps love or respect, and yet some have been willing to go to war for their country's benefit, it's claimed, and knowing they might not come back, or come back maimed physically or emotionally. And yet they fight. Others fight to preserve their honor, as in the past with duels. And so again, I ask, and we all ask perhaps, if what people want more than anything is, let's say, respect, and some are willing to die for it, or go to prison for it, case in point, this being discussed amongst others by Evie Pamperis in her book Bulletproof, when she was once a Secret Service agent, for instance. Why would this be then? Also the man who goes by the name of the Swan Group, and who wrote, amongst other books perhaps, Don't Split the Difference. Well, here's an interesting thought, perhaps. You would think if one is of a certain personality set, has certain traits, including great degree of love or empathy, or shall we call it respect, or, quote, good character, that this would be obvious. But is it? Can it easily be faked, in fact? Can it be faked by means such as use of chemical substances, to include tranquilizers, alcohol, or, say, drugs like Inderol, a beta blocker often used by musicians and some professors before performances or class lectures? Can it also be faked by imbibing a little bit of alcohol, sometimes a little bit throughout the day? Can it also be faked high levels of empathy, low levels of anger, and so on, through selectively appearing only when we're at our best? Or, as some salespeople do, by, quote, giving themselves a pep talk just before going out and selling something, or you might say in general, giving ourselves a pep talk and a smiling practice session in front of the mirror before going out and meeting certain key people for that day, so that we are, quote, at our best. Some even urge to dress well because that improves your self-esteem, and I would say in turn how you then relate to other people. Thus can a lot of factors go into faking who we are and covering over with veritable lipstick traits which might indicate we are much less loving, respectful, etc., than one might like to think oneself and want others to think. on whatever level we're processing that. Seems to me there are a number of ways to do this. And thus, surely some people wizened, savvy as time goes on, that you can't go by first impressions or even second impressions. Some, thus, who are on the dating scene, especially women, realizing that it was foolhardy for them to fall for a guy, date him for a while, or marry based on one or two impressions as to a first couple dates. One wants to size up a person thus as to traits I mentioned, being consistent over time. And even if chemical substances are used to mask your personality, hopefully in time and various circumstances, various environments, one gets to size up who someone is more accurately, to include consistency in a person. But even there, then, it can be difficult. There is, for instance, even a video out by Elaine de Botton from the School of Life in England entitled something to the effect of Why You Will Probably Marry the Wrong Person. I'm not sure he addresses any of these issues I mentioned per se, but the interesting concept being that many marry non-optimally, I would say. That not being everybody, though. And Napoleon Hill, or his mentor, Mr. Andrew Carnegie, having said in a book, How to Own Your Own Mind, that choosing well with respect to getting a spouse or marrying can be a very good thing. I won't comment further upon that, but at any rate, how then do you size people up? And why might it be difficult for some to give you the feeling that you are who you are if you are highly respectful, highly loving, of good character, call it what you will. Maybe they've been, quote, taken for a ride too many times based upon certain initial impressions that are fakeable, especially these days, especially with all the chemical substances available. Noting that Sadhguru, an Indian man in India, who is considered a spiritual leader of sorts there, has said once that 90% are taking chemicals or are utilizing them. I bring up one more factor here. There are several movies out on Mr. Fred Rogers, who had a show for years on PBS or other with children. And one of the movies, approximately around 2018, featured a reporter who sought to expose Mr. Rogers as a fake, a fraud, and in time came to conclude otherwise, and the movie was about this. I'm not sure if it's completely fictional, fiction or not, but the point being, this reporter thought Mr. Rogers to be a fraud, at least at first. Well, how could that be? Noting, of course, in the present era, you could argue even Mr. Rogers had taken chemical substances and was not exactly who you thought him to be. Noting, by the way, I met a man a year ago in a store in my hometown here who said he met Mr. Rogers' father when this individual here lived in the area or town where they both were at, Mr. Rogers and his father. Mr. Rogers was a young boy or man, the father of Mr. Rogers being a pharmacist, a druggist, if you will. You could thus argue maybe Fred Rogers utilized chemical substances as taught to him or encouraged to him by his father, who prescribed surely a great many chemical substances, when there were on the market plenty of tranquilizers, especially since the 1950s onward. So who knows these days who is who? And even some saying Mr. Rogers could have been a fake. In fact, I was shopping half a year ago in a box store, and one man talking about Mr. Rogers said, be careful of such a person. So you never know who trusts who, so to speak, who perceives who to be what these days, and why, especially with all the chemicals available to alter, at least on a short-term basis, our personalities. And with more and more doing so, it not being quite so perceptive to us all, that some look rather zoned out, and that being a sign then of chemical use. Alternatively, those living in a bubble where they feel safe with only their favorite type of people and vigorous or violent people, shall we say, kept to a minimum, this too conveying the impression somebody might be quite serene when taken out of their bubble of sorts, quite different, quite challenged, quite hypervigilant. I'll give a couple examples too from a week ago. I was in a very challenged, low-income environment in a major city in Kentucky, and two things happened. I went to a restroom in a gas station mart, and upon coming out, an individual called me a white honky. He didn't know me from Adam, and you might have thought, well, can't he perceive who I am by my character? Secondly, 2 minutes later in the parking lot of this gas station mart, an individual, different person, was wearing a shirt, a t-shirt, emblazoned with the phrase, God forgives you, but I don't. So two instances right there. And of course, with Chicago, instances of rioting and whatever having happened at the White House without my having a lot of details of it, not too far back, you have to wonder then whether there is great precedence to size all people up as one type when we're talking about groups. Or perhaps they're saying, well, everybody is the same in a certain group, and we are being oppressed because those who are kinder in a group are not saying anything, they're turning a blind eye, and so we regard all of them as toxic. I close with a reference I will make to a fascinating short little video on YouTube entitled Validation. And it is very fascinating about a man who is a parking attendant, and he validates tickets. And with his positive attitude, including validation of people's strengths, more and more people come to him to have their ticket validated just for the process of validating their strengths and their personality, the uplifting part of it all, to the consternation of the people who are running the parking garage. And it shows in the first part of the video how so many people are flocking to him, but for one woman who he finds his persona cannot change, cannot alter, or as I put it, cannot flip from a low state to a high state of hope, encouragement, happiness, at least temporarily. And he's consternated. Why? The rest of the film then, short, about 15 minutes in length, goes into how he tries and tries and tries and finally discovers an answer, going back to the woman's childhood. So you might say, not only might we find it consternating why we are sometimes not accepted for our strengths, especially if even profound and we think obvious, there might be realities based on perceptions of different groups. if someone is in a different group than you, socioeconomically especially, money-wise or race-wise, or finally, we never know what degree of trauma someone has had. That doesn't necessarily register skin deep or on the outside. You may have someone, in fact, quite wealthy, or showing their wealth even, or young and good-looking, beautiful body, as some call it, and be quite consternated to find in a relation with them at a store, say, or other, that you find them to be all of a sudden quite different. Rather reminiscent to me of having read once or seen a video in Forks and Knives magazine talking of how most all Americans have clogged arteries, perhaps to the degree of 90%, and we're simply walking possible heart attacks or strokes waiting to happen if we have a strong episode of anger or stress. So you have to wonder, can you even tell whether someone is highly traumatized from childhood by outward appearances? If you can't tell whether someone's blood vessels are highly occluded to 90% level by looking at who they are on the outside as to youth, relative beauty as we regard it these days, or money, what have you. How can you tell? It can be quite confusing. It seems to me thus the bottom line being, we can't please everyone all of the time, nor know just why things don't seem to be clicking along. If we have great assets, I think we simply have to realize you can't please everybody all the time. There being various instances of this. For even Mother Teresa has had an incendiary book, at least one, written on her, and many have not liked Gandhi, depending on race particularly. And there are many other instances too. Religious figures, leaders, politically, all down the line. Some support, some hate, and arguably some of great virtue. So how are we to know, to include if someone is not greatly skilled at advocating for their strengths that are not quite visible, and are not patient to let people get to know them over time, or are not opening up in terms of being vulnerable about saying anything of who they are. If we are in fact a blank, what use are we to a person other than a wall that is painted white? Now, a wall painted in psychedelic colors or a mural might be rather useful to some, but a simple generic white wall might be only comforting to those in a facility of some sort. And so some thoughts to consider here. When we feel rejected, and yet we have the feeling or data that lead us to believe we have great strengths, and yet we feel rejected or are rejected, not to despair. Some reasons I present here.